Well, Ed, how are you doing today?
Wonderful. How are you doing? I'm here in sunny England. It hasn't stopped raining for like 3 weeks now. The pubs have just opened, but yeah, I mean the weather's it's very, very British weather. It's
Oh
not any,
no,
yeah.
man. Yeah, I'm sorry. I know it's not good, especially not being able to get out at all. Just kind of closed in.
Yeah, we've got camping in a couple of weeks as well, so that's another kind of very British holiday. You go camping in the pouring rain, it's really cold, everyone's pretending it's not terrible, and it's just really unenjoyable for everyone.
I
But
love it. I love it. You got to roll with it, right? Um, well, Ed, before we get jump into some of the questions we have, could you give us kind of a brief bio and some of the big themes you're interested in?
Well, I suppose, I mean, the book I had out, Small Men on the Wrong Side of History, is really about conservatism. And that came out. It's all about my pessimistic worldview, and it kind of explores the sort of personality types of conservatism as well as the history. And it came out in England just as the week as we were hit by COVID-19. So my pessimism was proved completely correct in that case. I just knew there'd be some sort of plague as soon as the book came published. So that was mainly yeah, I mean, my basic theme is that I was born in 1978, so the sort of cohort, my generation, the people I know, but people upper middle class Londoners who went to university are sort of becoming are unusually liberal compared to previous generations, and they're not becoming more conservative, and the data and stats in the states as well has a kind of basically similar trends. So from the 70s and 80s, people born then aren't becoming sort of more liberal. In fact, they're becoming more liberal. Um, and so I'm a sort of anomaly amongst my generation, and I kind of see that as a sort of kind of cultural shift. I mean, the obvious analogies of the Reformation, and also the sort of Christianization of Rome in the fourth century, were a complete shift in culture. And I think that what happened in the 60s was kind of a completely huge cultural shift, just as what happens at like the 320s, and now we're in the next generation. And what happens in these kind of cultural revolutions is that 20, 30 years later, there's often like another like burst of energy, and a more extreme version of the new faith kind of comes along. Calvinism followed Lutheranism like 20 years later. And I think what we've seen in the last 7 or 8 years, the Great Awakening, is the kind of that second burst of energy, where it's like the real defeat of the old way. So I sort of identify with those people who in those previous revolutions were on the losing side, and you eventually grow up to see your grandchildren just in a sort of world which is completely unrecognizable, really. So it's quite that sounds quite bleak. Um, but yeah, I'm interested in history generally. So I read some sort of short, kind of young adult history books from American publisher, and all about English history. And I know you want to talk about. I sort of, while I was reading a lot about history in various ways, I was also interested in like the Franks and the start of Europe as an idea. And so I sort of published an ebook online, and it was sort of it's published by a small publisher. But yeah, that sort of interested me, like where Europe came from as an idea. And the only books around that, the 8th century and the Franks, was sort of Victorian books, which you can get on, Kindle's great for that, but the language is quite is archaic. So I thought there'll be nice to sort of update one. But yeah, so
Definitely.
there's my history, politics, and doom and decline. That's my theme.
I love it. I love it. And on this show, we always ask, whether the guests are optimist or pessimist. And we've talked to about 50 people now. And it's really interesting because every single one of them is an optimist.
Right.
We've got a couple of short-term pessimists, but and so I thought it was great. Like it's good to have a dissenting voice here. And that's part of the reason why I'm really excited to talk to you today.
No one ever accused me. I'm optimistic about some stuff in the long term. I think there'll be some good technological things in the long term.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not. I mean, I'm with Michel Welbeck. He said, "What the new world after COVID will be like?" Well, he said it'll be the same but worse.
I think he's on the money there. Well, Ed, I see a lot of your thinking and work around conservatism as kind of like a Chesterton's Fence argument or reminder that, we need to be really careful about changing things because institutions and practices can be important for reasons that aren't explicit. Um, we talked to Pete Leeson. I don't know if you know him, but he's an economist at George Mason. And he actually works on like medieval ordeals and like Sassy Wood and Liberia for determining judicial outcomes. And, you know, on its face, you know, the UN's like, don't use Sassy Wood. They give you like a fake poison to try to determine whether or not you've, you know, committed some crime. And it's a great social technology. But on the face, you don't understand it unless you kind of get to the correct level. Because it seems like bonkers, right? That you would, you know, this practice. What do you think about that? Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, the thing, I mean, all cultures, and this is the common things of all cultures, is they develop taboos and traditions, ways of doing things that don't really make sense, but and no one really understands. But over the long term, the ones that have proved really effective do so for a reason. You know, even if you go back to you know, reading about the greatest pandemic, the Mongols, when they used to hunt, you know, they have taboos about if a rodent is slow, you don't eat it, you don't catch it, because there's reason the rodent's slow. You know,
That's great.
they didn't know about the plague, but they knew there's something bad going on. If a rodent ran away from a Mongol, there's, you know, that's
yeah.
Yeah. So you know, institutions arise. Basically, I mean, this Burke's thing, isn't it? They rise as sort of evolutionary process from beginning with a sort of state of violence, and then they sort of mellow into legitimacy. You know, the royal family, obviously, the one wouldn't appeal to Americans so much, but the institution of royalty, which sort of remains in Britain despite all sort of rational. It's the most irrational thing. You'd never design a system like that. Not with our royal family. But you know, overwhelming, you know, data after data and survey after survey, study after survey shows that comparing different countries with monarchies and republics, the monarchies tend to be better run for all sorts of different reasons. There is a kind of sense to that system. I mean, you know, would you rather live in Syria or Jordan? There's like no, or you know, Algeria or Monaco. But you're just better off with the older system of government. Obviously, America has been pretty successful down here, so that's a. But America obviously had the advantage of many different other qualities as well. And
it's also a question whether, you know, America seems to be successful to the extent our presidents are monarchs, like so FDR, Lincoln, Washington. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, and that's been said. I mean, you know, the czar-like power of the US president. Yeah, I mean, that, and you know, obviously, I suppose in recent times, the two institutions that conservatives want to defend the most, the family and to a certain extent the church. And I mean, there's, you know, even the most hardened radical, I think, would struggle to find the argument that alternatives to the family have proved better, since, you know, every sort of experimental model, whether it's, you know, communes or lone parent families, always have worse outcomes on average. Well, you know, I think the benefits of the church are sort of more being taken seriously now. I mean, there is more serious debate about the benefits of religion now in England, only now that it's kind of become so sort of basically disappeared. While, you know, I think 20 years ago, 15 years ago, we were going through the whole new atheist thing, when that was the sort of the last power of the church. And now a lot of people are saying, well, actually, you know, even though if you're not a believer, it's obviously, there's a lot to be said for these institutions. So yeah, I mean, you know, Chesterton's Fence it's cited a lot for a very good reason. I think that sort of says something very interesting. And there's also the temptation that, you know, there are lots of incentives for destroying things and for knocking them down. Personal incentives for, you know, commentators of politics, because, you know, it's exciting, it's dynamic, and it makes one look sort of forward thinking, and in contrast, it's, you know, Chesterton is kind of quite a boring argument. It's like, well, let's just keep it the same. You know, there's no, you know, there's nothing to stir the blood there. Like, no, you know, that's so, you know, in a sort of a very visual age, you know, dominated not first by television and then social media, you know, the incentives are to do away with things because it makes one look, you know, glorious. But yeah, I'm always sort of thinking, you know, don't take away the fence because there's just going to be a bull in the next field, you know, which will be the case.
You've got to be quite careful. To what extent do you think people's political beliefs are just kind of inborn, genetic, and like pretty hardwired.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or a geneticist. I mean, what I looked at the literature, I know lots of the stuff is, I mean, most things pretty seem to be 50-50. I mean, that goes for any character trait.
Yeah.
Not our politics exactly, but the personality traits that tend to influence our politics. I mean, if you're more conscientious, you're more likely to be conservative, not necessarily, but if you're more neurotic, you're more likely to be left of centre, and same with openness, even more so, in fact. But these are all kind of situational, aren't they? I often wondered if I was growing up in a different, like if I was growing up in the late 19th century, would I be a liberal rather than Tory? And I think I probably would have been. I don't know. Most of my family were liberals. They were mostly non-conformists. So I don't know why I've come out like this. I think there are certain political events and triggers that might, in a more conservative people, might sort of trigger a more defensive response, a feeling that things are either changing too rapidly or something we care about is being threatened. And I think from the 60s onwards, there is a bit of that sense. There are certainly some. I mentioned in my book, my dad started off as like very like a young communist in the 50s, in that kind of upper class way. A lot of young Englishmen sort of looked to socialism as a better way after the war, and he just became so deeply reactionary by the end. Completely against universal voting. Entirely against the modern world. And his father was also apparently quite right wing as well. So maybe there is certainly some genetic influence on it, I think.
Definitely. It's quite interesting. And that leads me to my next question. Have you heard of the thrive survive theory of the political spectrum before?
Right. Yeah.
So I do wonder, and just for the listeners, the idea that if you need to survive, you adopt more conservative principles. Like if you're in a zombie apocalypse, you go get a bunch of guns, you go just like focus on your family. You're very skeptical of the outgroup. And
you read Ross Alexander as well, then, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I run a SSC meetup here in the Triangle.
Yeah. He's like the master.
Yes,
a big fan in London amongst lots of people.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting guy. I really like his work. So I do have a question. As we get richer, it seems like surviving becomes somewhat less important, and I wonder, does that kind of explain some of the slide leftward that is either perceived or real that's been going on?
Sure. I mean, my own prominent caveat to this is that every time I've sort of looked at any psychological study that looks into, I ask my psychologist friends after, say, oh, well, that one hasn't replicated, that one's bunked, and that one's, and almost every single psychology study is turns out to be. So it's just everything has to be sort of grain of salt. But yeah, of course, until the modern world, until the late 19th century, pretty much everyone lived in grinding poverty before the Industrial Revolution took off. So obviously people aren't going to be interested in like wild ideas of liberal individualism and progressivism and everything, and the things that would concern us would just seem utterly alien to them and inconsequential. And I mean, what you're describing is also, is another word for it is basically decadence, right?
Yeah.
And we're on to the top of the hierarchy of needs. I mean, one of the main objections to sort of all these cultural war issues is just that people are sort of kind of fighting and whining over nothing, really. And there's something very demoralizing about that, just hearing people complain about complete non-issues when they haven't really got many things to worry about. I mean, and part of you wonders, like, would you be happier? Like when the sort of social justice warriors is, blah, blah, someone, mispronounced my pronoun, or that cartoon racial stereotypes, this group. And I think, would you actually be happier in like a war zone or like a time of famine or something like that? Would, like, if you'd actually something to focus your mind on, maybe you'd actually be a happier person. I mean, like, I wouldn't. I'm quite happy to live in a decadent 21st century society where I can just eat food all day. But, I mean, I think part of it is a sort of, a lot of politics is just basically like an autoimmune system problem. So you know, like say this is the example with racism, particularly, you know, American, I say intelligentsia, but we're talking about like New York Times columnists, so that's probably not the right word, but they, you know, they're obsessed with racism, like a problem, an issue that has been declining by vast amounts in American society. American society now is probably like the least racially prejudiced of any society in history or in the world compared to any else in the world. I mean, apart from a bit of Western Europe, and even Western Europe is not as anti-racist as America. The more it's gone away, the more obsessed with it they are. So it's basically an autoimmune system. You know, your immune system can end up destroying you because it's, I mean, and that is what sometimes happens with COVID and with, you know, the Spanish flu. It was that the healthiest people die because their immune system becomes obsessed with this idea that it has to eradicate a disease that isn't actually a threat to them so much. So a lot of politics now is just people obsessed with kind of these overblown historical problems which aren't really much of an issue anymore. I mean, obviously every society has issues, but in this way I'm quite a Whig, you know, in the sense that we have got, you know, healthy and wealthy in most cases. And so people just find something to be angry about and to be upset about. And that kind of brings about this urge to sort of basically destroy institutions. I mean, you know, there is a certain extent from watching it on this side of the world that a lot of, you know, America's culture warriors really just want to, the ultimate thing is just to sort of basically wind up America as a concept because they think it's so inherently bad. And that's the kind of ultimate institution. Like you don't want to, I mean, that is the ultimate Chesterton's Fence, right?
Right.
You know, the country itself. And from this side of the Atlantic, you know, a force of stability and freedom for a long time for many of us. But there was a sense of, you know, we're just bored, so let's just, you know, create havoc and chaos and see what happens. Like, you know how it's going to end. This is going to be much worse than how it was before. And like all the people who want chaos and havoc tend to be, you know, university educated weaklings who will be the first to have their head taken by a rock or by a revolution. Like you guys always get killed in these revolutions. That happens in Russia, happens in France. Right. There's kind of need for, you know, drama and chaos and you know, change for its own sake, which to me is just like, that's a terrible idea.
Definitely. No, that's really well put. It seems like so virtual and unreal, and like the battles have gotten, yeah, it's quite interesting. I'm curious. So you live with a bunch of kind of, you know, in the US they call them, you know, it's this hilarious term, coastal elites or whatever.
Oh yeah,
right. And you know, it's you know, what's it like being you know, a conservative, and do you think it gives you a good perspective to be like integrated within this certain class of people and hold a different set of views?
Well, I mean, where I live, it's in North London. It's a sort, I mean, in English terms, it's zone 3. So that means, you know, we're talking 3 and 4 story, you know, quite dense. It's, I mean, it'll be somewhere like in Brooklyn would be the equivalent.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I mean, almost everywhere where I live, it's, I don't know, it was one of the highest Remain voting areas in the country, which was 75 to 80% Remain voting. So that's a sort of indication of gone to university, votes Labour or Liberal Democrats, you know, has all the right opinions. And I mean, a lot of people in the area, like fellow parents and friends, even not close friends, but people I sort of know, wouldn't really know about my politics. I don't really like shout about it and kind of keep quiet. I mean, the thing is, I mean, most metropolitan liberals, this kind of this group of which I'm sort of semi a part of. I mean, I am sort of one of the liberal elite. There's no denying it. I'm just like a very right-wing member of the liberal elite. I'm not a very elite member. But they have no kind of hesitancy about just talking about in the room, like as if everyone has the same opinions as them, which I find a really strange thing. So I've never had that in my entire life. Assuming everyone would, like, you know, obviously, like, leave is a terrible idea. Obviously, America is inherently racist, and, you know, blah blah. Obviously, BLM is a great idea. We should all take the knee, etc. And these are kind of, I don't know, like accepted. I mean, if I just turn around and say, no, I don't agree with any of that, it would just be very weird. But the funny thing is, like, even in my area, even here, a quarter of people voted leave. And I mean, there aren't that many old people around here. So normally in an area, it's like old people vote leave.
Yeah.
So there are many other people like me, but they're just very, very quiet. And I think it's like that in most institutions. You know, in universities, there will be a lot more conservative people, very quiet. I mean, I get a lot of, you know, direct messages or emails from people saying, you know, obviously I can't tweet what you wrote, but I agree with it because I would just lose my job, or just everyone, you know, most people just don't want to be hated by everyone, do they?
Yeah.
It's kind of human nature. I mean, I know amongst like the guys near here, that I've like one friend who's, you know, definitely also a conservative. I mean, last year before last, we went out for a drink after the election nearby to have a good like gloat in private. Everyone else in the area looks like downcast. It's like the same look when England
Trying to hide your smile. Yeah.
It's like, I'm so depressed. Yes. So it's yeah, I mean, it is very much a coast. I mean, and the thing about people on the centre left is they tend to sort of congregate physically into the same areas. I mean, that is one of the reasons why they're losing elections in Britain, is because they're all tightly wound up pounds in like a few constituencies. Like my constituency, the Labour has a 50,000 majority, which is no use to them as a party, because the Tories are winning loads of seats up north with majorities of 3,000 and 4,000, so they're just ending up with huge. But you know, the tendency of the great sort, isn't it, is towards educated centre-left people to move all into one area, which makes, you know, it's kind of like, you know, so there is a bit of a lack of diversity in opinions, which I think maybe is bad for them as a coherent ideology. You know, I think it's important to try to understand your opponents. You know, the ideological Turing test is like really like a good thing to do, to try to see if you could pass one of them. And you know, you read a lot of newspaper columns. I read a lot of newspaper columns from people on the British left, and I get impressions that you've got no idea what I actually think about, like what I actually believe about the world. I mean, it's really like off. You can never go undercover at one of my like party events and pretend to be one of us, because you just don't really know, and you probably just haven't been exposed to that. But what? I don't know if that's maybe both sides are bad at that. I don't know.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to me, because it seems like one of the weird problems we've gotten is, you know, like you mentioned, like, so if Labor's got a 50,000 vote majority in like this one district, and if you won, so you're let's say you've won like 95%, and there's only 5% dissenting, it's like you've passed some threshold where you can like it's essentially anyone you talk to is going to have these beliefs. So you just like don't even, it's not, you assume one way.
It's beyond politics almost, isn't it? It's not controversy anymore. It's just an accepted view.
Yeah.
But I mean, they never have as much as the majority as they think they do. That's the thing.
Gotcha.
I mean, the referendum, I mean, I have complicated views on the whole referendum, but the referendum was, you know, like a left-right kind of divide. It had the effect of drastically, you know, shifting British politics. And so we went through the sort of great realignment. America went 4 decades over from the 60s. It happened to us really quickly all of a sudden. So we went, you know, you had seats which had been Labour since the beginning of time, which were quite working class, suddenly became Tory, which is unthinkable like 10 years ago. But during that period, it was very much, there was a sort of asymmetry about the whole thing, in that there would be entire like Remain voting cultural areas, you know, academia, civil service, local government, places, and, you know, amongst social medias where everyone is Remain, and people were really quite scared, worried about opening, saying as Leave, and I don't think that really happens the other way so much. You know, and I mean, now that debate is kind of over. The vaccine thing has sort of at least ended it for now. So I think, but for a while it was, it was quite divisive.
It's quite interesting. So I remember, and side note, I remember when y'all voted to leave, I remember I was in the car, I had this old truck, and I was listening to the radio. I was listening to the BBC because it comes on the public radio like late at night, and I went to get like a burger or something, and I just remember the broadcaster, like I turned on the radio, and the broadcaster, you know, when they just like, they're horrified, and you can hear it in their voice. And I was like, what is going on here? Because, you know, I'd read about it in like The Economist that this was going on, but I didn't know, you know, that this would actually happen, right? But it was just quite interesting.
Summer music at BBC, like the Royal, you know, the royal family died or something.
Exactly.
And apparently they were. I mean, obviously, I mean, it's not a secret. Obviously, most people at the BBC would be Remain voting, which is fine. I don't know, complain about that. It's the media. I mean, the media do tend to be of a certain political stripe. But yeah, there was a lot of people were very upset.
Right. It's quite interesting. I do wonder, so I spent a bit of time in London, and the thing I noticed was the divide between America and the UK in the big metropoles. Like I live in a big metropole, and in London, it was, the beliefs were very similar, almost indistinguishable.
Yeah.
But the urban rural, like, so I'm from rural Eastern North Carolina, and it's like so far. It's farther from like 60 miles away from where I'm sitting now than London, which is, thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
What do you think about this big sort and this big this urban rural divide that has developed? Do you think this is kind of a new phenomenon, or
it's a sort of exaggerated form of something that went on? I mean, it's definitely become more extreme. I mean, I think most of the sort of social changes in the last 50 years are just basically like dispersion. That's when they talk about finances, rather than splitting in two, everyone's got the freedom to live the life they want. So everyone becomes, much more extreme. So, we talk about a lot of, there's a lot of focus on people who, for example, boys who are quite feminine and girls who are quite masculine, and the intersex thing. But far more men are like super more masculine than they would have been 50 years ago. They're taking steroids, they're down the gym all the time. Well, like half of women are on like Instagram dressed up as sort of Barbie dolls. Not half, but there's much more dispersion. So like, the gender norms aren't becoming the same, they're actually becoming wider. And I think that's the same with people's, their politics to a certain extent, and just their lifestyle. People have more freedom to move. And if you want to be, living in an urban pod eating insects and reading you got much more freedom to do that. While if you want to go out and have 9 kids in your tradcath, family out in the community, right, there are more people doing that. So yes, I suppose the more freedom we have, the more extreme our lifestyle differences. And I mean, liberalism has always been like linked to singleness, being single, being singleness, not even a word, I'm forgetting how to speak. Childlessness, basically. Like almost all the great early liberal philosophers were childless men. John Locke being the main example, who had some pretty bonkers views about human nature as well. So the more liberalism today is now hugely related to people's marital status. Especially single women are overwhelmingly on the left now, and while women used to be more conservative than men 40 years ago, and that's the same in Britain and America. While married women tend to be, they're very strongly pro-Republican in their voting. I think that difference is slightly less marked in England, but England's also more constrained by its kind of geography. It's smaller, it's harder to, there aren't that many rural places in the south, right. And England is just very heavily built up. And that's partly the difference in the country's politics, is that Britain and England in particular are very urban. But yeah, that's the Tories now get, I think at the last election, the local elections we had, Labour had well over 50% in London, while the Tories had like more than 50% in people living in villages, and like over 40% in people living in small towns. They definitely had it's entirely now geographically built. And again, urbanism density also correlates to how likely you are to have children, because how expensive housing is. So those are just sort of, politics is just an extension of like sort of lifestyle values, isn't it? Although there are obviously loads of different exceptions there, because I live in an area which is very like, everyone has kids here. There's loads of primary schools. This is where liberals go to breed, basically. And yet they here, even then, people maintain their sort of general liberal values even after having children. But yeah, those are the basic trends, aren't they? And that's kind of bad news for Conservatives, because England in particular is becoming denser, more heavily populated.
Got it.
So in the long term, that's not great for us. The problem is for Conservatives as well is that the financial power is in those big cities. Like mega cities dominate the economy now, and Democrats, in terms of the counties with where the money is, and where the educated people are, they overwhelming advantage against the Republicans, and that's a kind of similar trend happening to us. So I mean, like, is the future Conservatism just going to be in sort of like left behind towns? I mean, it's called flyover in America, but that's kind of become a bit of a cliche in discourse town, because like it'll be nice to have it's the contradiction. Conservatives, like, I believe in elitism. I just think we should have a better elite, like a less sentimental and less narcissistic and self-serving elite. I would like the best people to be running things. I have no problem with that. I just want someone like Lord Salisbury from the 1890s to do it, rather than like the kind of sociopaths you see on Twitter. So there is a contradiction of that. With conservatism loses so many of the educated, then it kind of turns into populism, which kind of has a sort of kind of like almost ignorance has become, anti-intellectualism becomes part of the identity of conservatism, which is quite a bad idea. I mean, that's happened in the past. Lots of conservative movements have been quite anti-intellectual because a lot of intellectuals talk complete crap. So I mean, it's natural, but
right.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, those are slightly concerning trends for the future.
Definitely. I do wonder, I have this sense that there's been this general decline. And have you heard of Palladium magazine?
Yeah.
Okay. So we had one of the editor-in-chiefs in Palladium on a couple weeks ago. And he talked a lot about the decline in social responsibility of elites in the West. And, he charts this going back to the 70s. Do you think that's like a real effect? It does seem like that it's gotten, I don't know, like it's gotten more like focused on the individual. It's less like so, I grew up in a mill town. They shipped out the mills to China because it was like, you can make a little bit more money if you do that, and you just box up the factory, you move it out, and the people, oh well, who cares? A lot of this free trade rhetoric seems to be focused on that. Do you think that's a real effect?
Yeah, I think there is a less of a sense. I mean, I think in this, I agree with this on the meritocracy thing. Meritocracy has led to a bit of that happening, but less of the sense of, elites now much more like to think they deserve whether to be where they are. If you're at the top of the thing, and I went to this college and I worked hard and I got the. Well, before meritocracy was kind of normalized, then elites were aware that they didn't really deserve to be where they were. Like, you just got it because your great grandfather happened to behead someone on the back, or like great grandmother slept with Charles II, so she got something. I think there is a little bit of sense of that. I definitely get the feeling with, and part of the, I suppose, the populist conservative opposition to like woke politics. I hate that word woke, but it does convey a certain worldview. Is the kind of sense of real entitlement and privilege you get amongst a sort of type of, I don't know, American elites, which is kind of spread, come out of an Ivy League school, fantastically wealthy and privileged, and just enjoying incredible amounts of wealth, and yet their entire identity is, serviced around an idea that they've been somehow victimized, either because they're female or because they're, from a minority, often from minorities who are fantastically privileged back in their home country. I mean, that's the funniest thing to me is, how much of the social justice rhetoric is from Indian Americans and Arab Americans and Gulf Arabs, who've had hundreds of literally a Brahmin lecturing nice white people from Vermont about their white privilege and about how racist they are. It's literally you had a racial hierarchy for thousands of years before thought something, and you still have an incredible privilege back home. Sort of making a grift living off these kind of naive sort of liberals. In Scandinavia and the sort of basically American parts of Scandinavia. I find that's just, it's so brilliantly funny and twisted at the same time. But, I don't think the people that have a sense of obligation to everyone else. I don't think they do. I mean, I think there is certainly a sort of, polls show that wealthy people have much less sympathy for poor people, both in the States and in Britain, if those poor people are white, which is they no longer have the protection of, they no longer have any victim status. So they're poor. So it's kind of, tough. That's your own fault. You're a loser. And there is definitely been the growth of that. Now, traditionally conservatives are more likely to think that because they're just had harsher views about the poor. So in one sense, I'm not in a position to complain about it. I say, but I do think like people on the left, that should be your like specialist area, right? Like if you're not like speaking up for poor people, like who the hell is going to speak up for them? And so obviously populists are going to speak up for them because, you can't have a society where the very wealthy don't feel some obligation towards the people in their own country, who are less well off than them. They think, oh, I've just got just as much obligation to like some guy in Chad or Indonesia, because no one's fooled by that. It just means if you have just as much obligation to everyone in the world, you have obligation to no one in the world. I mean, that's if the whole world is my brother, then no one is my brother. That's afraid. You've got to have a society where there is some sense of loyalty towards. And I don't think it's a complete naive, like nostalgic idea. I mean, the best measurement of whether that's true in the past is, in the First World War, 22% of old Etonians died in combat. That compares to about 13% for, like, the soldiers in the trenches, the privates in the trenches. The English upper class, the British upper class, died in far greater numbers than the people they were leading. I mean, that was the ultimate. That is putting your money where your mouth is. Like, sure, you can talk all about the system and and noblesse oblige, but whatever. But terrible pronunciation. But you've got to put your money where your mouth is, and I just don't believe those people now coming out of Harvard and Yale who are on lecturing the rest of us on privilege and etc. I just can't imagine somehow they would be the first to like jump in front of the I don't see that sense of obligation. I don't think that's a completely like nostalgic, naive view of the past. I think there was some sense that way.
Yeah, no, that's really well put. I like that statistic you gave about Etonians dying in the trenches at a higher rate, and it's contrasting that today to this big settlement McKinsey just had to make where they had to pay like $700 million because they were advising Purdue Pharma on how to turbocharge their opiate sales, poor America, and it's just like, wow, like we've gone from that to this. It seems like
the opiate thing is just the most shocking, scandalous. I mean, I wonder if that's kind of thing that we think about 19th century, the things that shock us are child labor and the treatment of minors in both senses. I wonder people the like kind of really recklessly evil way, the way that opiates were sold to Americans is really mind blowing, and it took so long for it to become a thing. I mean, are people angry about that a lot?
It's a good question. I mean, I think people are angry. I mean, it is bizarre. It's not. It's one of those things where it's not addressed a lot because the groups that are affected by it. I mean, I have a friend. He still lives in Eastern North Carolina, and he was going to Office Depot, and there's someone laid out in front of the Office Depot, and no one, just people were walking past them, and it's just this general degradation of society. It's just concerning about caring for people that just doesn't seem to happen as much anymore.
Yeah, that's horrible.
I'm not sure. I wanted to ask you about tech stagnation, like the Ross Dow. I know you mentioned decadence a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Tech, the Peter Thiel, kind of Tyler Cowen, Ross Dow.
I read his book. I'm a big fan of Ross Dow. I'm not convinced that we have a stagnation though. I mean, I don't. Isn't it just that it just gets harder and harder? That's what I mean. That sounds stupid. Like, once you invented like the most obvious, once you invented a car, obviously inventing a car is quite hard.
Yeah.
But then you invent a plane. Like, the stuff after that is going to get really, really, really hard, isn't it? It's just, I think in the 20th century we're just lucky to have a sort of period where, all those basic improvements were done. and even stuff like washing machines and dishwashers make huge impact on people's lives.
Right.
All the drudgery was basically gone. I don't know about that. I mean, I agree with him on the space thing, but again, when I kind of mention that to people, they kind of look at me like I'm a crank. I think there's something about exploration as a kind of moral principle that we have to, like, if we're not exploring and trying to expand as a species, then I think we have sort of reached a kind of brick wall. Like we have to, I think we like almost obligated to do that, right?
Right.
So I agree with him on the whole like Star Trek thing. I don't know. I mean, like Peter Thiel is like much cleverer than me. So I mean, if he thinks something, I'm just kind of obliged to think, well, okay, you obviously know about this stuff than I do. So
Ed, that seems to be a very good point, in that when we have invented enough technology to easily address our basic needs, we tend to get a little lazy. But the proof that we can still do important things is probably something like the vaccine.
exactly, right, yeah. So that took. I mean, Moderna did it in literally a weekend. But I mean, the
Yeah.
regulator stopped them. But everyone at the time said, oh well, it takes 20, 30 years to the vaccine. But I think it's kind of one of those things where, if someone puts a gun at your head, sort of thing, it's a real, like, there's a worldwide pandemic. Like we'll find a way. If nothing else, it's going to make us find that technology. So I think the incentives. I mean, a lot of those stuff becomes. I mean, a lot of political questions are just harder now than they used to be. I mean, this comes down to trade as well. Like the trade issue, which came out of Brexit, is so complicated because as time goes by, these trade agreements and these trade laws just become much more complicated that the average person doesn't understand it. So I think a lot of this issues come down to like the regulation, American regulation, and how the regulatory system works, which is quite complicated. So I think there is an argument that that there's a kind of slowing down of the system by bureaucracy. But I mean, I don't know how anyone breaks that. I mean, I would love for people just to give Peter Thiel his own country, because I would love to see how it worked out. It could be amazing. Like it'll be a super futuristic, near medieval paradise where people live to 1,000.
Right.
Incredible. But I just really want to see that happen because test out those ideas.
Definitely give it a try, right, and see what happens. Do you think perhaps tech stagnation, if it's happening, if we pick the low-hanging fruit and growth slows down a little bit, or the rate of growth slows down a little bit, it's more like trying to divide this pie that's not getting bigger as fast. And so do you think that explains any of our, why the political fights are so vivid?
I mean, the period after the Second World War was, I mean, it appears that we're not really going to get that level of growth again, right? I mean, a lot of that is just basically starting from a low base, and a lot of it is just was the population structure, wasn't it? I mean, it's basically, the people born at the end of the war were just very lucky to be born at an incredible time of growth. And I don't know. I mean, now we're sort of constrained by housing costs to such an extent, which I think that certainly in England, that is the number one. That is the number one real problem that people have. I mean, apart from like the wider, the environment, whatever. That is the actual real issue is the cost of housing, which is a really hard one to get.
Right.
Like the younger people, how do you sort of give them reason to like invest in the system?
Yeah.
There's just no hope of them ever having a house or a flat in London or a shed or a wardrobe. I mean, they're going to be, the cost of housing is just like absurd now. And we're in a really bit of a death spiral because the Tory party is completely, basically, their voters are the people who have homes and they're all older. And that home is basically, they'll need it to pay for their old age because it's their savings.
It's a retirement plan.
Yeah, it's all their savings are in homes. So they can't just sort of say, all right, we're going to allow millions of homes built because no one, they don't want their voters.
Destroy all that wealth.
As the housing gets more and more expensive, the younger generation just get fewer in number, and the birth rate falls off. So I mean, that is probably my most sort of reactionary, pessimistic world opinion is, that like a country's fertility rates probably do represent something quite, dark and depressing. I hear you've got a dog in the background.
Yeah, sorry, my
It's all right.
puppy's heard somebody's. He's like, "Oh God, danger."
Right, we've got a dog.
Well, Ed, that's a really good point. So, on the positive side, there is an easy solution, right? You just build more housing, although it's very difficult to get there, right? Like,
Yeah, it's politically very difficult.
right. Are you down for a couple of overrated, underrated? So I throw out a term.
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. So Charles Martel, overrated, underrated?
Well, he's probably overrated by the wrong people. That's the bit of a bit popular.
That's a problem.
Sinister. No, I was really. I mean, I just thought it's such a fascinating story. Obviously, it should, like, as a caveat, say that Charles Martel is very popular with like some quite extreme craze types because.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Well, because the battle tour, the Battle Poitiers in France, that was basically the great victory. Whether the actual so basically the Arabs had conquered Spain, what is now Spain, they call Andalus, and then they crossed into Gaul, which became Francia, in 721 at first. And then they tried again, and they had a huge army, a huge empire at the time, controlled. In time at least, was absolutely gigantic, and the Franks were this tribe who had come over from really Western Germany, what is now Holland, into northern France, and they had this kind of rudimentary kingdom amongst. But this was, post-Roman Europe. It was the actual sort of lowest point of Western Europe, population being devastated by plague and by the various other disasters, and it was very sparse and very. Quite primitive by that stage. There are, very small towns left, and so these group of sort of Franco-German barbarians were invaded by the biggest empire at the time, who were much more sophisticated culturally, and they won. I mean, but very little is actually known about the people involved, and this became, a Catholic. A Catholic priest writing about it afterwards, or as a monk, used for the first time to describe all the victors, the battle tour, as the Europeans. It's the first time the term was used. There was no real concept, or Europe is an older word, but because these are people who are a mixture of German and various Latin-speaking peoples who were sort of united by their Catholic faith, and that was what sort of defined them as a sort of civilization. And so that became sort of the start of Europe, and the Franks built. Basically, they're the forerunners of France and Germany, and they eventually split. And so, French history, we go to France every year, and it's just the history is just fantastic. It always fascinates me. So I just wanted to write a small thing about that thing. But obviously, because Charles Martel defeated the Muslims, he's sort of popular amongst certain
questionable
folks. Unsavory types.
Yeah.
Put it mildly. So overrated and underrated, I suppose. Can I give one of those cop-out answers?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
The best answers are Edmund Burke, overrated, underrated.
He can't be rated enough, really. I mean, he's the prophet for all British conservatism comes down to him, and I think he's still a good guide to principles. I mean, what I find interesting about the late 18th century is when the French Revolution starts, all the sort of political. Before that, some forms of politics are recognizable. From that point on, like every archetype is basically recognizable. I mean, what's interesting in English history now is that for 100 years we've had our politics has been, the Conservatives versus the Labour Party. The Labour Party is socialists, and the debate was really about like how much money do you redistribute. So now we're going back to the previous political position we had, which at the time in Burke, which is basically Whigs versus Tories, which was much more of a cultural war issue. The Whigs were the liberal elites, they tend to often be non-conformists. The Tories were the sort of party of the countryside, and older traditions and the Church of England, and the mass of people sympathise with the Tories because no one really likes the Liberal elite. No one ever does. So we've sort of gone back to that, really, our politics now. So
Right.
the cultural war is a return to normal. But from that point on, the 18th century, everything is sort of recognised, all the archetypes. So obviously, all of Britain's playwrights, all of Britain's poets, everyone who's an intellectual of any sort supported the French Revolution, thought it was the best idea ever. Even when it started turning into a complete bloodbath, they say, the ideals of
It's great.
and literally like blood everywhere, everyone's getting killed. Eventually, when it all turned into a complete dictatorship, Napoleon took over, and Britain and France entered World War. And by that stage, obviously, this is like after 1956 to be a communist. That no one, but some people begrudgingly said, okay, we have to support England, because Britain's intelligentsia hates supporting their own country because they consider it just the worst thing in the world. And Edmund Burke was from the beginning when this all happened, and everyone was saying, great, they've stormed the Bastille. The Bastille just had a handful of forgers and one like sexual pervert in it. It wasn't really an oppressive prison or anything. They literally turned up the Bastille, just like hacked the guy, the guy in charge of its death. And from the very start, like he said, well, listen, this is going to turn into a complete mass murder. You just can't get rid of the monarchy and just have complete anarchy. This entire system run by journalists, lawyers, and actors, like the worst people running the country. And he said it's going to turn disaster, and he was completely right. But at the time, everyone said, oh, you're just being an old reactionary, you're completely wrong. And then he died before he was proved right. And, he just sort of went slowly became more paranoid as he thought the rest of the world was against him. But, that's the kind of Cassandra curse of conservatives,
Right.
You tell everyone like bad things going to happen. No one really wants to believe you, and it does. So.
Right. Do you think would it be appropriate? This is a bit of a left turn, but I think it's related. Is it appropriate to think of the American Revolution as kind of like a British kind of class struggle, or like maybe not class struggle, but like kind of like internal political struggle? Yeah,
I do agree. The Kevin Phillips idea that it's just a sort of sequel to the English Civil War, I think there's definitely something in that. That's the thing I'd love to write a book about, because obviously my girls are obsessed with the American Revolution. Not obsessed with it, but they know everything about it because of the obvious reason, Hamilton. They know all about it. And yeah, I think it's a fascinating thing. But yes, it was a sort of conflict between the Whigs and the Tories, wasn't it? But
yeah,
the Tories were basically mostly driven out of the country. And the American revolutionaries were were Whigs. They were sort of the merchants. They were dissenters who were fighting against the Church of England. But yeah, they were very. They were very British in their politics. Hamilton is kind of one of the most sympathetic figures. Jefferson is a bit more. He's interesting, but he's a bit less palatable for British people, I think.
Right.
Yeah, I think that argument that it was a sequel to. Even the first Civil War, even the English Civil War, lots of Harvard graduates went to fight. It did draw in America. There was a battle in Maryland in the English Civil War. They're two.
I didn't know that. That's great.
The two conflicts were intertwined. Your part of the world was obviously the Cavalier. That was the deep Cavalier heart of it. But I think there's definitely a truth in that. Yeah. Now, obviously, it's the other way around. Now we're sort of being sucked into American, political, cultural battle. So we're the sort of outpost. But there's that's the common thread.
It's interesting. So I got one more here. Boris Johnson, overrated or underrated?
I think I'm not a fan, I have to say. I think he's. The problem is, I don't know. The details of it. He's very popular with people, and he's good at winning. But he is a journalist. So his latest, he has a completely chaotic life at the moment. He's got a personal sort of financial mess. His love life is complete. He was basically homeless when he became Prime Minister. He was staying in his girlfriend's flat in Camberwell, South London, having a row with her with sort of wine on the sofa. And journalists tend to be quite chaotic people. If you read economists that tweet, I think that Twitter account has been probably taken down by now. Journalists with their L owning their L's, whatever. It's just like list the journalists and all the chaotic, disastrous things they do in their lives. These are people with a track record of making terrible choices in their lives, and that's why they go into journalism. And Boris Johnson was, a journalist. He would just always, file late, file the job, really inconsistent, really unreliable sort of person. Great at articulating and making off the cuff speeches and being fun and everything. But you don't really want those kind of people running the country, especially when there's like a pandemic. You want some boring middle manager, type, or best of all, you want someone like an airline pilot, like a cool under pressure, someone who knows what they're doing, always checks everything like 15 times.
Right.
But I think Britain handled the COVID thing really disastrously, and he wasn't even turning up to these kind of Cobra meetings at the beginning. That's when that's the sort of emergency meeting. He was just too busy with his kind of chaotic journalist life, and I think we really suffered. But I don't think anyone really cares in the polls. So I'm like an anti-bellwether of British public opinion. So whatever I say will be like the opposite of everyone else thinks. And he just goes up and up and up. So he's he'll certainly win the next election, I'm sure.
It's quite interesting. Well, Ed, thank you so much for coming on. I want to recommend your books. I really like the small books on history. They're quite good if you ever want to get a primer on any of those subjects. I think they've all been excellent. And you just had a new one come out, isn't that correct? Not one of the small books, but you had a Tory Boy.
No, but that's just that the publisher gave a different title to the paperback of Small Men Alongside History. So that's
okay.
Yeah, publishers do that sometimes for the original, but there we go.
Great.
But so that's the same. So don't buy that book twice, and if you do, don't give me a 1-star review on Amazon.
Right. Fair enough. That's good. Well, thanks, Ed. Do you have any parting thoughts, and where can people find your writing?
Well, just go to Unheard, where I'm the senior editor. Unheard without an A, UNHERD.com. So that's where I am always. So I should be, pretty much every week.
Awesome.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ed.